They cause pain and death to others, but once behind bars, they often become victims themselves. There can be many reasons that push other prisoners to kill a maniac, but most often it is the desire to rise higher in the prison hierarchy in personal hatred. One of the most terrible serial killers of the 20th century, cannibal and necrophile Jeffrey Dahmer, took the lives of 17 men. He could not be caught for 13 years, until Tracy Edwards, who was supposed to become the maniac's next victim, escaped from his lair and called the police. Dahmer was sentenced to 16 life terms. He fully admitted his guilt. The maniac spent the first year of his imprisonment in solitary confinement, then agreed to be transferred to a general block. There he was assigned to work in the form of daily 2-hour cleaning of the gym and toilets. One day, Dahmer, along with 2 other prisoners, began their duties when the guards left the gym, leaving the trio unattended for 20 minutes. At this time, Christopher Scarver, one of Dahmer's cellmates, attacked him with metal reinforcement, causing serious head injuries to the maniac. Just an hour after the incident, Dahmer died in the hospital without regaining consciousness. He was 34 years old. It was the second attempt on his life in 2.5 years spent in prison. Leroy Martin. From May 1967 to February 1968, Martin killed 2 women and 2 girls in his native Southern California. He had never had any problems with the law before. He led a measured life, worked in a textile factory, was married and was the father of 3 children. For the crimes he committed, the court sentenced Martin to 4 life sentences, but he will only serve a little more than 4 years. On May 31, 1972, he was fatally stabbed by another prisoner, Kenneth Ramsey. Martin was 35 years old at the time of his death. Incidentally, the husband of the maniac's first victim was convicted of her murder. After Martin's arrest, the man, who had served 3 months by that time, was released. José Antonio Rodríguez Vega, a Spanish serial killer who killed at least 16 women aged between 61 and 93. He always took something from each of their homes as a souvenir. He later placed these things in his apartment. It is believed that Vega committed the crimes out of hatred for his mother, who kicked him out of the house. Before that, the future maniac attacked his seriously ill father with his fists. For the totality of his crimes, the court sentenced the killer to 440 years in prison. Of these, he spent the first 9 years calmly and even earned the status of a model prisoner. But on October 22, 2002, Vega was transferred to a block for especially dangerous criminals for an unspecified reason. Just 2 days later, during a walk, a couple of other convicts killed him in front of the guards, who did not intervene. He was 44 years old. Charles Schmid. This maniac, who was incredibly self-conscious about his height of 160 centimeters, preferred to attack teenage girls. Officially, he had 3 victims, but the police believe there were more. In 1966, Schmid was found guilty of the charges and sentenced to death. A few years later, the state of Arizona imposed a moratorium on the execution of such sentences, and instead, the court measured out 50 years in prison for the criminal. A year later, he escaped from custody, held a family hostage for several days, into whose house he had broken into, but was then captured and returned behind barbed wire. In March 1975, the maniac was seriously wounded with a knife as a result of an attack by 2 prisoners. 10 days later, 32-year-old Schmid died in a prison hospital. His mother refused to take his body for burial, fearing that the killer's grave would be constantly desecrated. Albert DeSalvo. From 1962 to 1964, 13 women were murdered in the American city of Boston. The police linked their cases together, calling the alleged maniac the Boston Strangler. 3 years later, Albert DeSalvo, arrested for a series of abuses, confessed that he was the Boston Strangler. However, his involvement in only 1 crime was officially proven. In the other 12 cases, there was no physical evidence, and DeSalvo often got his testimony mixed up, made mistakes in details, or did not know them at all. In 1967, the criminal was sentenced to life imprisonment. 8 years later, he died at the hands of Robert Wilson. It is believed that the prisoner thus dealt with a competitor who began selling illegal substances at a lower price than the overseers accepted. The debate about whether DeSalvo is really the Boston Strangler is still ongoing. Donald Harvey. During the 17 years that Harvey worked as an orderly in hospitals in Kentucky and Ohio, he took the lives of at least 33 elderly patients, and 4 more of the victims were his acquaintances. The criminal himself insisted that the number of his victims exceeded 80. After serving 30 years in prison, on March 28, 2017, Harvey was attacked by his cellmate James Elliott, and died from his injuries 2 days later. At the trial, Elliott fully admitted guilt for the crime and said, "I think part of me saw this as an opportunity to finally do something good for my neighbors. And balance the karmic scales in my favor." In addition to the main term, the serial killer received life imprisonment, but it seemed that he was not upset about it at all. "I hope everyone in our community can take some comfort in the fact that someone gave Harvey the punishment he should have received in court," he said.